on Sky News Australia. This is the Rita Panahi Show.
Good evening and welcome to the Rita Panahi Show. Coming up tonight, Labor senators turn against the immigration minister. New research shows almost 1 in 3 jobs created last year was for the NDIS. Who's the Liberal leader who wants to push for gender quotas, not for Parliament, but the cockpit? And Scotland's mad trans laws come into effect, and JK Rowling is trying her darn best to get arrested. I'll have legendary Irish writer Graham Linehan, the man behind Father Ted and Black Books, in the studio to discuss. Renowned geologist Ian Plimer will be fact-checking the hapless Minister for Climate Change, Chris Bowen. And as always, Lefties Losing It tonight, featuring this lovely lass making a powerful point in the dignified manner we've come to expect from the left.
This is the only topic they have. This is the group that's saying that we're Christian. Please don't touch me.
Get the back.
And with the release of Abigail Shrier's Bad Therapy, I'll have a leading child psychologist joining me to discuss the impact of social media and far-left activism on the mental health of youngsters. And perhaps she can answer this curious finding from Abigail Shrier.
Even though teenage girls have the worst mental health in general, boys from liberal families had worse mental health than girls from conservative families in terms of anxiety and depression. So why should that be?
Why is that indeed? Claire Rowe on that issue later in the hour. Let's bring in media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth, for today's big headline. Sophie, the Albanese government is in a world of trouble when 3 Labor senators are rebelling against its emergency migration laws, saying they would give Immigration Minister Andrew Giles too much power. This is the man who sat by while the High Court released dozens of criminal detainees. Well, they're saying he should not receive broad and unfettered discretion to ban citizens from certain countries from applying for visas to Australia. This is according to a non-partisan committee with members from the Greens, Liberals and Labor. Giles is an activist, Sophie. His heart isn't in this. He advocated for the Tampa asylum seekers. Now he's wanting to ban citizens from certain countries. It's sort of going from one extreme to the other. But you've got 3 Labor senators here who are saying, no, this is not a good idea. I mean, that is quite a rebuke.
Isn't it, Rita? Isn't it interesting that this report came out in The Australian today, and the fact that these Labor senators are actually saying no? But what concerns me, Rita, is when governments try and rush through legislation, act in haste. This legislation, they were only given, was it 36 hours or very short space of time to review it, which isn't enough to get expert advice, legal advice. So I think it is a good move that it's been questioned and that hasn't just been pushed through.
Now, among 1 in 3 jobs created over the past year, among 1 in 3 was due to the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Just look at the rate of NDIS job growth compared to total employment. It is rapid and it's unsustainable, Sophie. When you compare it to the private sector jobs, this is economically devastating for taxpayers. What can be done about this issue? Because the expenditure we're having in that area and the number of people who are now falling under that umbrella of the NDIS who really shouldn't. There are people there who need the NDIS who are absolutely legitimate cases, and then there's others who are now falling under this very broad umbrella.
Well, Rita, that's exactly the point, isn't it? The NDIS, I think, is a very important scheme and helps a lot of people, as you said, that do need it. But unfortunately, like with all these sorts of things, when there is money being handed out, there is rorting. And I think that is one thing that the government really needs to look at, and they have been looking at, is cracking down people who are accessing money that perhaps shouldn't be. But obviously this expenditure here, it's not sustainable, Rita. It can't just keep growing at this rapid pace.
Sticking with bad economic data, we were expecting 3 to 4 interest rate cuts this year, but now the Australian Financial Review is reporting that economists are predicting there will be no rate cuts in 2024, or at least none until November. They're arguing inflation just isn't slowing as fast as other countries and the job market remains too tight. Sophie, this is bad news for home buyers. We're going to see a lot more people pushed into mortgage stress.
Absolutely, Rita. I mean, we've got a cash rate that is quite high now compared to what it was during COVID when it was, right down near zero. We've had, 13 rate rises, and that is obviously impacting people. Their cost of living is going up, but we have a share market that's at record highs. We've got house prices going up. Everything seems to be going up. So these rate cuts, as economists say, probably won't come this year if their predictions are correct.
Now, we've got the Deputy Opposition Leader, Susan Ley. She's decided it's crucially important that we have gender balance in the cockpit. She is launching an audit that will push major airlines to boost women's participation and hit gender equality targets. But Sophie, if women don't want to fly, then they don't want to fly. I mean, Susan Ley should accept that. This is a free country. We're not some backward country where women are oppressed. And I would have thought there's one job above all others where you do not want any sort of quotas, including gender quotas, and that's airline pilots. I mean, I just find this just a bizarre thing for a supposedly conservative politician to be pursuing.
Rita, it's baffling to see why she would make this an issue. Gender quotas.
She's a pilot herself, so
that's right. That's right. She has got that experience herself.
Maybe she should apply to go work for.
But Rita, why aren't we going back to where people are, looking for jobs and people are being hired for jobs because they're the best person, not what their gender makeup is, and just filling gender quotas, I think, is not a good thing.
Are you talking about the M word, merit? That's almost a dirty word. I have a trigger warning for the audience because, only bigots use that kind of word. Well, yeah, I just find this bizarre. This is a big issue overseas. There's been a lot of controversy, particularly in the US, with airlines pushing for different types of quotas, gender quotas, diversity quotas of other types. And it's never embraced because we all fly and the last thing you want is to guess whether the pilot is there fulfilling a quota. Now, we normally save this content for Lefties Losing It, but let me play you this bizarre content from our Electoral Commission made by some, millennial or Gen Z staffer with too much time on their hands.
We're at the AEC. Of course we have a democracy sausage floaty for our pool.
We're the AEC. Of course we have our own personalised democracy sauce in the fridge.
Ground floor.
We're the AEC. Of course we wear purple to work.
We're the AEC. Of course we have a democracy sausage dog.
We're the AEC. Of course we read the Commonwealth Electoral Act over lunch.
Wow. This is a online trend, but it's normally done in an amusing or thought-provoking way, not just lame and embarrassing like we just saw. And Sophie, given the criticism the AEC has copped in recent years, particularly during the Voice referendum when they were accused of having a bias, you'd think they'd leave this foolishness alone, leave it to the TikTokers.
Well, that's right, Rita. And during the Voice, when we're talking about ticks and crosses and what they were going to mean in the voting, yes or no for the Voice, that's a serious issue that they should be focused on. And I really don't think it would be in the AEC's remit to try and push out comedy content.
Is that what that was? That was
because
comedy.
Their attempt at comedy wasn't that great. But Rita, we are paying, taxpayers are paying for this, and I don't think people would find that very amusing.
No, if it was even mildly amusing, you could say, okay, you justify the waste of resources or time it took to put it together. But yeah, I'm shocked they decided to just, press send on that one. Now, let's go to the US, where Biden's lax border policies are causing all sorts of consequences, not just illegal immigration crisis, millions crossing illegally, but also adding to the crime problem. You've got drug dealers, human traffickers, sex offenders, but there are also Chilean gangs stealing millions from householders. Have a look at this news report.
A team of burglars can go undetected. Months ago, the sheriff formed a task force and caught 7 people from Chile who'd been breaking in and getting away with millions, $800,000 in jewelry and cash from one home alone.
The Chilean gangs have been hitting us very hard. Cash, jewelry, very high-end purses, that's pretty much the target. They're super well trained when they get here, highly organized. They look like ninjas. They're all masked up, gloves. They each have a backpack with their particular set of tools for their job in the burglary.
Looks like an Ocean's 11 remake there. But this is reaching the blue cities as well. It was once something that was confined to border towns, but that border crisis, the illegal immigration crisis, just a complete loss of control is having an impact in New York, Oakland there, all across the country.
Well, Rita, as you know, and you've discussed many times, this is going to be very important coming up to the presidential election. And this never looks good for whoever is the president in office. And so Joe Biden should be extremely concerned every time this sort of news makes headlines, because from what we can see and, you know, people commenting on it, they don't like it.
No, absolutely not. Now, you know I love a cruise, so this story grabbed my interest immediately. 2 Australians are among 8 passengers stranded on an African island after their cruise ship prevented them from boarding. Apparently, they were late from a excursion. A spokesperson for the cruise line insists the group missed the all-aboard time, and that's why they've stranded on the Central African island of Sao Tome. I've never even heard of that place. They've got no money, no medication, even their travel documents all are back on the ship, obviously. The group insists they made adequate measures to warn the ship's captain that they were going to be late, yet the Norwegian cruise liner left without them. This is a nightmare because you have port days when you go on a cruise where you go off the ship and you've got a certain time you have to be back. But sometimes, you know, there's accidents, there's things you can't predict. For the ship just to take off, not just to hang around for a couple of hours and maybe give you a stern talking to and a fine. This is pretty drastic. I mean, they're stranded on some tiny African island.
It is, but you'll probably disagree with me here. But when they hold up the whole cruise ship, how long are they meant to wait? And I'd like to know a little bit more detail. I reserve my judgment. But there is nothing worse when you're on a tour and you've got guests who just decide to go off and do their own thing and hold everyone else up. Throws everything out.
Oh, you are just ruthless, Sophie Ellsworth. So you are happy for these poor Australians to be there without medication,
we won't be cruising together,
without
Rita.
money, just fending for themselves in some African island because, gosh, you could not be delayed half an hour from, I don't know, cocktail hour or something. Come on, it's just too much. I mean, of course, it's got to be within reason. You know, if they were 6 hours late, if they were going to miss their next port, if they didn't leave, but. Come on. Now, finally, Donald Trump's younger son, Barron, made a rare appearance at Mar-a-Lago this weekend for Easter brunch. Let's have a look at him. He's absolutely towering over his mum, Melania, who's also quite tall. He's turned 18 just this month, Sophie, last month, I should say. And with his enormous height and Slovenian heritage, many folks are demanding that the Trumps put a basketball in his hand.
Well, Rita, I looked it up. He's 2 metres and 1 centimetre, so he's 6'5". And his mum is 1.8 and his father 1.8 metres and his father is 1.9. So they're a very tall family, but he's over the 2 metre mark. He should take up basketball for sure.
He should. And, yeah, the Slovenians do very well in that area. Sophie Ellsworth, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time this evening. Victoria's Heathcote wine region could be next on the renewable chopping block as the state government plans to build Australia's largest solar farm there. Once again, farmers and our beautiful landscape are coming second to the green dream, even when that dream is apparently being built against state and local government planning guidelines. Joining me now is leading geologist Ian Plimer. Ian, we've got more than 60 businesses, farmers and residents trying to oppose this project, saying it's going against guidelines meant to preserve productive agricultural land. And there's hardly more fertile land than wine country, and Australian wine lovers would tell you some of the very best product comes from that region. So Why are they building a solar farm there?
Well, this is the normal MO of those who are pushing renewables. We fast-track renewables and we bulldoze everything. We bulldoze public opinion. We kill any wildlife. If it's in Queensland, we just wipe out the rainforests. We kill off farming. Objections are ignored. Whether you contravene planning laws or not, it doesn't matter. There's no mechanism of appeal. And high-value agricultural land is actually turned into something worthless. Because if we get hailstorms like we had in Texas last week, then we totally destroy this solar industrial facility. It's not a farm, it's an industrial facility. And if we have a hailstorm, it'll destroy it and we'll leave very, very dangerous chemicals, cadmium chemicals, tellurium chemicals. These will be left in the soils forever. So I think the farmers have got every reason to object. Farmers are getting treated dreadfully in this country, and they are having cheap Chinese panels just dumped on them. And in fact, these panels are so cheap, and there's so many of them, that in parts of Europe, and especially the UK, people are building fences out of them. So why should we take someone else's garbage, owned by a foreign company, to actually destroy some of our prime lands? And I have to say, I'm a great admirer of the Heathcote Pinot Noirs.
Good Shiraz from that region as well. Well, Chris Bowen is not giving up on his dream for everyone to be buying expensive, ineffective electric vehicles. This is despite the troubled rollout of the EV charging stations across the country. And meanwhile, we've got the Climate Change Minister and the PM being criticised for taking not one, but 2 jets to the Hunter Valley to promote a renewables fund. Ian, how did the Climate Change Minister defend this? It seems an astonishing decision for him to make. Let's have a listen to his response.
The Prime Minister has a large jet available to him. That would normally be what we take. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jet, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for 2 small jets.
It was impossible for you to go together in the one plane.
Even the small jets weren't fully laden because of the weight restrictions on the. Even if we had, with the Prime Minister's security detail and other people involved, going from, as you'd imagine, the Prime Ministerial visit, 2 cabinet ministers, we limited the number of staff, and even then, that was the Air Force advice, the most efficient way of getting us there.
What do you make of that, Ian? Does that pass the pub test?
Well, it certainly doesn't. It's just rank hypocrisy. And if Mr. Bowen knew something about the state that he comes from, he would know that the airport at Scone once used to have Fokker Friendships land there. Now, you can land the equivalent to a Fokker Friendship, and that is a Dash 8, where you could have the Prime Minister, all sorts of hangers-on that you'd want, and you'd easily fill a Dash 8 and you wouldn't have any problems. Yes, it might take 20 minutes longer. Who are these people to waste taxpayers' money thinking they're so important that they've got to have a couple of jets to fly to a regional area? Why don't they actually travel on a commercial plane? Why don't they actually meet people who travel on, say, a Jetstar flight? Why don't they go by train up to Scone and actually meet people who are struggling and travel by train? This is rank hypocrisy, and they're in Scone to promote an absolutely useless scheme anyway, because they have to be told time and time again that no one has ever shown that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. So the whole business of wind turbines, solar facilities, EVs, the whole lot is built on a house of cards. No one has ever shown that human emissions drive climate change.
Well, Chris Bowen certainly believes it does, and we have a raft of policies in this country from that position. So the hypocrisy there to not find another solution other than to take 2 little jets for this announcement, that's what's extraordinary here. Sometimes circumstances are what they are, but for someone who preaches this stuff day and night to not be living it himself. And I noticed this post from One Nation's National Director, Craig Kelly, had this to say. He said, To attend a photo opportunity at Liddell, Blackout Bowen, that's what he calls him, could have flown into Newcastle Airport on a commercial flight and travelled in a chauffeur-driven limo, which is a 1 hour and 30-minute drive. But instead, Blackout had taxpayers pick up the tab for a private jet to take him to Scone Airport with a 44-minute car trip to Liddell. So for the saving of 46 minutes there, we had 2 jets making this trip rather than a commercial flight. It's a hard one to justify, but I wonder if it's going to be soon forgotten with the 24-hour news cycle, Ian.
Well, when Labor are in opposition, they're for the working man. They are concerned about waste. They're concerned about transparency. But as soon as they get into government, they have the champagne and caviar life. They don't care. Whereas the old song, you know, the working class can kiss my ass. I've got the boss's job at last. And that's the way the Labor Party perform when they're in power.
Ian Plimer, thank you so much for your time this evening. And still to come, why are so many youngsters depressed and suffering from anxiety disorders? Is it social media? Is it grievance politics? I'll have a leading child psychologist to discuss the latest data. Plus, Lefties Losing It. Welcome back. Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. Let's start with this charming lass who's making an important point and doing it in a most elegant and dignified manner.
Touch me. This is the only tactic they have. This is the group that's saying that we're Christian fascists. Hey, dude. Please don't touch me.
Get the back. Get out of here. Get out of here.
Please do not touch me.
Now to this triggered woman who has a message for the over 40s.
Yo, I guess I'm gonna need to be the one to explain to all of the 40-year-old people and above, so 40 plus. Yo, you guys keep sending out these thumbs up emojis and they look more like this to the Gen Z and millennials. Yo, we depict the thumbs up as a it's rude.
Look, I guess I'm going to be the one to explain this to all the Gen Z and millennials that we don't care. If you can't regulate your emotions to deal with a thumbs up emoji, then your problems are a lot deeper than even your therapist can appreciate. Now to Canada, and let's see how kind and inclusive and sane these pro-Palestinian protesters are. First, they call this cameraman a pedophile, and it only got worse from there.
I heard you touch kids.
Fuck me, huh? Nah, what? Nah.
Howard.
So they call him a coward as they attack in a pack wearing masks and even assault the guy, physically trying to knock the camera out of his hand. Let's see how this interaction ends.
Don't touch her, okay? Don't touch her.
Don't touch him either. Leave our neighborhood.
Don't touch her, okay?
He touches little kids.
Don't touch her.
Don't touch her. Excuse me? Let go of my flag. Look.
Stop sticking your stuff in his face.
He shouldn't be here. We don't want you here. No, we don't want you here.
She claims
We
that
don't
she's
want
half
you
Palestinian.
here.
She's half Palestinian.
Yeah, and I had the misfortune of being born here. What do you want from me?
You want Palestine?
You're on the wrong side, clearly. You're Palestine, buddy.
I don't touch you.
Go ahead, talk to him.
I'm not right now, but I will.
Get this out of my face.
You're creating an issue. You touch kids, we heard.
And it ends how it began, with crazy defamatory claims of what a charming group of people with a really sound moral compass. Perhaps their issues began with their politics. Here is best-selling author Abigail Shrier. We're going to be hearing more from her shortly, explaining to Joe Rogan that Liberals, Lefties Losing It, have more issues than Conservatives.
Even though teenage girls have the worst mental health in general, boys from liberal families had worse mental health than girls from conservative families in terms of anxiety and depression. So why should that be?
So teenage girls have the worst mental health in general, and yet boys from leftist families have worse mental health than girls from conservative families. And having to live with the sort of people we've been looking at tonight, you can understand why. And on that note, let's end with Jonathan Haidt. He's a renowned author, academic, and he's on US 60 Minutes talking about why so many girls are identifying as transgender.
Girls are connecting on social media, where it just turns out in many communities, the more anxious and depressed you are, the more you get support. The more extreme your symptoms, the more you get likes and followers. You know, of course, it's good to destigmatize social mental illness. We don't want people to be ashamed, but boy, is it a terrible idea to valorize it. To tell young people, you know what? The more you have this, the more popular you'll be, the more support you'll get. And so you get this explosion, not just of anxiety. Anxiety is in part, I think, spread sociogenically, it's called, from social causes, not from internal causes. But we get it for dissociative identity disorder, and it seems to be the case for gender dysphoria as well.
And you think that the data demonstrates that it is above and beyond just the phenomenon of coming out and increased awareness?
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it happens in clusters of girls. It happens in clusters of girls who had no previous gender dysphoria when they were young. So it's very different from the kinds of gender dysphoria cases that we've known about for decades. I mean, it is a real thing. But what happened, especially when girls got YouTube and Instagram early, but then especially TikTok, girls just, girls get sucked into these vortices and they take on each other's purported mental illnesses.
And we talk a lot on this show about the medical scandal that is transgender care, but it's not just hormones and puberty blockers doctors are prescribing to minors. Nearly 500,000 prescriptions for antidepressants are being given to children and adolescents each year in the UK alone. In the US, a new study reveals antidepressant prescriptions for young adults and teens increased by nearly 64% from 2020 onward. But are drugs the answer to the problems of lost and lonely teens? And is therapy in some cases doing more harm than good? Family psychologist Claire Rowe joins me now. Claire, guidelines for the National Health Service state antidepressants should only be administered to patients suffering from severe cases of depression. Is that what's happening, or are we sometimes medicalising normal human emotions?
Yeah, thanks, Rita. And I'll just say that it's not just when we talk about teenagers on antidepressants, it's not just, that age that we're talking about. We're talking about a steep rise in primary school aged children. I have children who attend my clinic who have already been prescribed SSRIs, anti-anxiety, antidepressant drugs at 6, 7, 8 years old. So whilst that's not overly common, it is increasing from certainly throughout my career of the last 15 to 20 years. So I don't know whether, it loses its value, how many times experts like myself can call out how bad things are. But of course, medication is a Band-Aid. But I'm getting to the point where I'm not sure now whether can we reverse some of the things that are causing such damage to our children, because essentially it is social media, the internet, the way parenting practice have drastically changed in the last 20 years. And certainly just modern life and the way we live our lives now is what is causing so much damage to our children. So is it reversible? Yes, it is. It is. I mean, within 1 year, we could change child mental health. I absolutely believe that. Do I think it's going to happen? Pessimistically, I don't, because what it would take is every parent to take a mobile phone off their children, for every parent to get on board with a return to basics of how they're going to parent their children. That is, in not so much of a child-centred, permissive stance where we're so concerned about emotional safety and physical safety, and we actually let kids explore the world, become independent, get some resilience, get some experiences. So it would require such kind of almost collective class action that I don't think that it's going to happen. However, if we did that, would child mental health improve without the use of medication? I 100% think it would.
Now, author Abigail Schreier has just released a new book called Bad Therapy, and it's all about how bad therapy practices are actually making depressed and anxious teenagers even worse off than they would be. She was on the Joe Rogan show recently. Let's have a listen.
They recently did these studies on these, coping techniques. They taught coping techniques to teenagers, over 1,000 teenagers in Australia. It was called the Wise Teens Program. They talked to, that was the point. It was just to help them with emotional regulation. And it turned out it made kids sadder and more anxious. They measured this. And the reason was regularly ruminating on your bad feelings can make you feel worse. And it's the number one symptom of depression is what they call rumination, this pathological obsessing over your pain.
Yeah.
That's why stuff like exercise, that's one of the reasons, aside from chemical reasons, one of the reasons that doing anything, that running errands is good for your mental health, getting out of your house and accomplishing anything is good for you. But sitting around talking and thinking about your problems, that's a bad habit. And the best cognitive behavioral therapists and others, the dialectical behavioral therapists, the ones who do really well with depression, the first thing they do is try to break that bad pattern. But a lot of therapists just indulge it.
Claire, is that how you see it, that some therapists are making their patients worse by having them ruminate about every little grievance?
Rita, I've been in contact with Abigail Schreier, and this is the book I should have written. It's just like, I love this book, and I am so pleased that she's calling it out. She's not a therapist herself, but she's a journalist who's done a lot of research. This is absolutely the case. I wrote an article some time ago now called Why Mental Health Education is Making Us Sick. What has happened is we throw more and more money at educating people about mental health. And what happens is that mental health diagnoses rise. Now, if you had that with any other medical condition, the more money we throw at breast cancer, diagnoses are coming down. Mental health is the only area that the more preventative work and treatment of billions of dollars we pour into it, the diagnoses rise. Now, some would argue in my industry that is because more people are feeling like they can come forward, we're reducing the stigma, and we're essentially catching more cases. That might be the case, I would argue, for a very small proportion of why we're seeing mental health diagnoses rise. What Abigail was saying there is absolutely correct. There is a very strong correlation between symptoms of depression and anxiety and this thing we call self-introspection. So that is essentially the more that you spend time thinking about yourself and how you're feeling, the more depressed you're going to become, right? My children have emotion check-ins at school multiple times a day. This is not just therapists doing it. This is the world. We concentrate continually asking children, how do they feel? How do they feel? How do they feel? And it's not helpful. What we know by research is helpful is actually looking outward, getting out, doing things for others, and having a purpose, having goals to work towards. So absolutely, I think therapy, and I'm, a child psychologist now saying we are part of the problem for a lot of kids. And psychologists moved at one point from treating the very clinically unwell patient to now treating the worried well. And when you have a child that's slightly worried about a new situation and you put them in front of a therapist for 10 sessions under Medicare, and that therapist spends 10 hours of having that child reiterate to them why they're worried, what there is to worry about, what could possibly go wrong, and how they feel about it, they come out worse. And this is a huge problem that I am just so thankful is finally being discussed with research to back it.
Well, Abigail Schreier also spoke about why some therapists, prefer patients with these minor problems than those with really serious mental health issues.
Also, the incentive is for therapists to treat the least sick for the longest period of time. That's the incentive. Because you don't want the schizophrenic patient who really needs you.
Right.
They're really hard to treat.
Almost impossible.
Almost impossible, right? You don't want the bipolar patient.
Right.
Some people will refuse to see those patients. But a teenager with a little social anxiety, parent pays on time, they're not getting violent in your session.
Oh, boy. Wow.
Claire, that shook me up because I'd never even thought of it in those terms. But it makes sense. It makes sense why many therapists would prefer that type of patient. A kid who's suffering from climate anxiety, for example, as opposed to someone who's got a serious mental health issues, perhaps drug issues. You don't know if they're going to show up. You don't know if they're going to be violent. You don't know if they're going to pay the bill. And you compare that to a affluent child from an affluent family who's going to be there for every session.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things here. One, parents are highly motivated to help their children. They'll do whatever it takes, okay? So there's a certain preying on that. And two, it's quite an unequal relationship when you have a child and therapist in the same room. Can that child push back and say, well, I don't really agree with that, or I'm done with therapy now? So that's another concern.
Yes.
But yeah, it's much easier to treat the worried well than it is clinically unwell, unpredictable, very hard long-term patients.
Claire, thank you so much for your time this evening. It has been illuminating. And still to come, JK Rowling is begging Scotland police to arrest her for misgendering people. And they now have the power to do just that. Renowned Irish comedy writer Graham Linehan joins me next to discuss after this. Welcome back. Protesters defending free speech held a demonstration outside Scottish Parliament today after the Orwellian Hate Crime and Public Order Act came into effect. This act will make it an offence for people to make threatening or abusive behaviour which is intended to stir up hatred. But the bar is pretty low for what constitutes a hate crime. It also includes what some consider insulting behaviour, deliberately misgendering a dude with a full beard with a penis who says he's a woman. Well, that could lead to an arrest. Naturally, Harry Potter author and Scottish resident JK Rowling is a fierce critic of these laws. She has dared Scotland police to arrest her for saying trans women aren't women. In a series of posts on X today, she identified several trans activists and trans sex offenders before stating freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal. I'm currently out of the country, but if what I've written here qualifies as an offence under the terms of the new Act, I look forward to being arrested when I return to the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment. Joining me now is renowned Irish comedy writer, the talent behind Father Ted and Black Books, to name just a couple, Graham Linehan. You've been a victim of the trans lobby yourself, then more emboldened and more empowered now than ever, particularly in Scotland. What do you think of these new laws? Would you be feeling comfortable performing a show in Scotland under these laws?
Oh, I already tried to perform a show in Scotland, but the arts community there decided that I was unsafe. So I ended up doing it outside Scottish Parliament. It's just a joke, really. I mean, like, comedy is something that absolutely has to walk the edge of offensiveness all the time. You're playing with people's expectations. You're playing with what's sayable and what's not sayable. And they're trying to make comedy and experimental thought, you might say, out of bounds. So it's kind of an absurd situation that we can't laugh about. And since I started talking about this issue, and I was never particularly interested in being funny about this issue. I think it's deadly serious.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
I think children are being hurt and women's rights are being destroyed. And since I started speaking out about it, I was contacted. The police came to my door twice, which really frightened my wife. and added to the pressure on our marriage. Trans activists, when they found they couldn't stop me from talking, they came for my family. I had a musical that was ready to go, a Father Ted musical that was actually, all the songs were written. It was actually, we'd rehearsed it even a few times, and that was shut down by the kind of cowards who were producing it. So it's just been, I mean, by now I'm just used to it. And
but you shouldn't be used to it. And you think about a work of art, like a musical, an original piece, all the people who would have been employed, all the people would have enjoyed seeing it, and all of that's gone because of a few bullies who, I guess, spooked the theatre and the
spooked the producers. Yeah, I mean, they don't realise that these are often, crazy people online who are basically, who will never turn up to the theatre and who actually don't have any intention of, They wouldn't be brave enough to come along and disrupt something like that. And also, as soon as you start to vocalise the positions, they fall apart because they're talking about sterilising children, making it impossible for women to talk about their lives, and it's indefensible. And at no point did any of my colleagues on the musical say the very simple things of, for instance, of course women deserve fair sport. Of course women deserve single-sex spaces. These are basic feminist opinions, and they're seemingly beyond every single colleague I had in the entertainment world.
And sadly, they're beyond many in the feminist movement, because though there are some very strong women there who are fighting this fight, the majority in the modern feminist movement are siding with the trans lobby. And you see that when you talk about women's shelters, women who have been abused, perhaps even raped, but the shelters need to be inclusive of trans women. And that's also been an enormous issue in the UK.
Well, one of the most extraordinary things that JK Rowling has just brought attention to is the story of Midrul Wadha, who is a trans-identified male who now runs a Scottish rape crisis services. I have received 2 pieces by rape survivors who are saying that they're self-excluding because of him. He actually said something along the lines of bigots get raped too, So the idea of actually subjecting yourself to someone like that is extraordinary. And there was a podcast, a very kind of popular feminist podcast called The Guilty Feminist. And it was on their show that he said these disgusting things, and they didn't pick him up on it. So it seems like there's a kind of a trance that certain people are under. And I don't consider them feminists, because feminists put women ahead of men. And these kind of, I would call them podcast feminists, are putting men's feelings above women's safety.
Now, you're probably best known for Father Ted, much loved series here in Australia, but I've got to say my favourite amongst your works was Black Books. Can we just play a little bit of it just to remind the audience if they're not familiar?
You know, I'm probably getting a lot of secondary smoke from you. Don't worry about it. Get me a drink sometime.
Is there another brilliant, we call that a sitcom, a comedy in your future?
Well, I gave up trying a few years ago because all the doors that were previously open to me just suddenly shut. There was a Comedy Awards ceremony where I was given a Lifetime Achievement Award and a standing ovation from a group of people who are now who just basically watched silently as my life was destroyed. So I don't really have any respect for the UK entertainment scene anymore. I think they're all cowards. I think there's a lot of people who I gave them their break. One example is Graham Norton, who have basically just sat back while women's rights have been destroyed and gay rights are lesbians especially are coming under terrible attack. And even if I was able to work in the UK again, I don't think I would, because I don't think I could work with these people.
You can't forgive them. Because don't you feel there is despite these laws in Scotland, that there is a turning, the tide is perhaps turning a little bit? You've had the NHS come out and ban puberty blockers and other treatments, medical treatments for under 18s. I mean, that was probably unthinkable 5 years ago. You suggested that, you were called a bigot, and now it's policy. But do you feel like the people have shown their true colours and you can work with them again?
Yeah, I compare it to, in my book, I compare it to, there was a famous story that Pia Zadora, a famously bad actress, or at least a kind of maligned actress, played Anne Frank in a production. And when the Germans came in, someone in the audience shouted, "She's in the attic." And I just suddenly realized that I was surrounded by people who would shout, "He's in the attic," if it saved their skin. So it's kind of, in a way, I feel it's good that I know that about these people, because you wouldn't want to get into those kinds of dire straits and have to trust them. But in another sense, it's really destabilizing when you realize how many people, you know, the things I was pointing out were not controversial. You know, women deserve fair sport. Single-sex spaces keep women safe. People can't change sex. And yet they kind of allowed generations of gay kids to go onto a kind of surgical production line where their bodies were harmed. And all these kids are going to wake up and realize that the whole of society, including some of their favorite artists, just let them do it, you know, by shouting trans rights and not examining the issue properly.
Do you think that opinion, or that sort of echo chamber that exists in the entertainment world, is it because of the fear that if they step outside of that, they're going to cop the sort of treatment you've copped? Or is it a genuinely held belief amongst them all? Do they really think men can have babies, women can have penises? Where does that ideology come from?
That's a really good question. I think I'll be wondering about that for the rest of my life. One of the people I got into a kind of public argument with was a journalist called John Ronson. You know, he was actually made famous because he wrote a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. So I thought he would be all over this issue because women were being shamed on an industrial level. And yet, no, he didn't seem to understand the issue. He seems to think everyone who disagrees with the trans lobby is a bigot. And I genuinely can't imagine that he genuinely believes that women can have a penis and that lesbians can be male. I think he's just, I don't know what to call it, but I do think it's, as a journalist, one of your duties is to the truth. And I think that, like, the people who are betraying the truth on the basis of fashion or because they want to be friends with their kids are frauds.
You're absolutely right there. Now, you're in town for your comedy writing masterclass and book launch. Nearly didn't make it. There was all sorts of efforts to stop you coming into the country. Since you've been here, have you been welcomed? Have you faced any other sort of hostility or mad bureaucrats who've tried to stop you from seeing your fans?
Yeah, it's always faceless people. Like I believe one person to do with the City of Melbourne said that I wouldn't be allowed to do my comedy class in any City of Melbourne venue because I would make the venues unsafe.
Oh, yeah. Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
City of Melbourne. Okay.
So, but you never meet these. You know, early on, I tried to have discussions with these people and say, well, what exactly do you disagree with that I'm saying? And they never want to do that because their positions are built on nothing. You know, they're absurd, and also they're homophobic. You know, like the idea that lesbians can have a penis is a homophobic idea.
That's it.
So they're terrified of meeting me. You know, there were some protesters. I was in New Zealand, and there were some protesters who stood up and started shouting, and I asked for them to stay so they could ask me questions, and they left faster than the security, you know, because they don't want to have these positions examined.
They don't want to have a good faith debate. They want to silence and intimidate you, don't they?
Have you ever had someone here who disagrees with you on this issue? I mean, they won't come on because they know that if they come on, there's no leaders in this movement, you know? It's a weird leaderless movement because they can't afford to have someone come on TV and have these ridiculous ideas exposed.
And yet it's a movement that has enormous influence, disproportionate power. We really appreciate your insights, and I'm still crossing my fingers for the next Black Books, because that was brilliant. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
That's it from me tonight. Don't go anywhere. News Night is up next. I'll see you at 11 tomorrow night. Good night.